more exciting.
And it's liftoff.
Exactly. John Kraus, welcome to the Astroben podcast. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you for coming on. I'm very excited. Normally, before a guest comes on the podcast, I have to request a couple of pictures from them to use for thumbnails to promote the episode. But yeah, you've just sent me through a few links that I have seen before, but just the most epic pictures of Falcon
Oh,
Heavies
thank
and
you.
starships. So yeah, thank you for that. um,
Yeah,
it just
it's
it,
a exciting time to photograph stuff in space.
Yeah, I wonder, how do you decide on what you have for your desktop on your phone and your computer? Because you've got so many good pictures. Do you have one picture that you're particularly proud of?
It's really hard to nail it down to one, but I actually have a rotating catalog for my desktop. So I have a Lightroom export preset that puts it in a cloud-based folder, and then my laptop and of course the display will every minute cycle through those photos. And there's a couple hundred in there from all stages of my photography career. So I'm always seeing, literally on a minute by minute basis, um, the history of my work randomly. So sometimes it'll be a photo from yesterday, sometimes it'll be a photo from 7, 8 years ago almost now. And that really has me self-critiquing all the time, and it helps expose me to, I guess, new ideas through old ideas, which is really great because rocket launches are inherently very exciting events, but I'd say having shot almost 200 now, we are kind of approaching the limit of what can be done. But I've been saying that for a few years now. So, but yeah, it's a random rotating catalog, and it always is showing me my own work.
What do you mean the limit? Do you just mean you can only photograph one rocket so many times, or do you just mean like I don't know? Because what are the variables? It's like what camera you use, how far away you take it, when you take it, like on a very basic level. Because I don't really understand photography, but what are the how else can you push the envelope in capturing unique pictures?
That's kind of the ultimate question, right? So I like going in planes. I like going on boats. Just sort of increasing the scope of where I can be. Lately, I've tried actually willingly being a little farther from the launch than I otherwise would have liked to be a couple years ago. I think there's an interesting sort of genre of photography where the rocket might not be the most predominant thing in the frame. Maybe it's actually a beach landscape with the rocket just launching in the background because you're some 20, 25 miles away from the launch pad. Um, so it's just an ever growing challenge of how do I showcase something that's fundamentally very, very exciting, but in new ways. Um, and it's enjoyable. It really is a challenge finding those new angles, trying out new things because there's such a high launch cadence here at the Cape now that you really can afford to experiment and fail. And you use that knowledge to then go into the bigger launches with more confidence that you know if you try something that a couple years ago might have been maybe a little too risky or atypical, you feel good about doing it on the launches where that really matters.
You talk about not being afraid to make mistakes, but have you ever made like a complete rookie mistake, like left the lens cap on, or forgot to turn it on and left it out overnight? Is there something that sort of springs to mind as like a crucial launch that you messed up?
Yeah, yeah, very much along those lines, actually. My, I think, second trip and latest trip to Vandenberg, actually, it was in late 2018 for the SAOCOM 1A launch, which was a Twilight Falcon 9 launch and landing. It was the first time they ever brought a booster back to Vandenberg for landing versus landing on a drone ship. And what's novel about that launch site is the landing facility is a few hundred feet from the launch pad. So there was an opportunity to get the launch and the landing quite literally in the exact same frame versus, here at the Cape, those facilities are miles away and you have to be much more strategic about capturing both of those facilities and events in the same frame. But at Vandenberg, it was much easier. It was a twilight launch. It was spectacular. And a newer dynamic was that I had invested the time and capital in traveling to Vandenberg to cover this launch versus the launch being in Florida where I live just hour away from the facilities. And in shooting a long exposure with the Nikon camera I was using, there's a bulb setting, which generally you have to hold down the shutter remote or the shutter button to take a long exposure. And as soon as you release that button, the exposure will end. But on Nikon, or at least most Nikons, there's a setting called time, which is one dial click beyond bulb. And with time, you press to start it and you press it again to end it. So it's a sort of binary on off. And if you don't do anything in between, it stays in the state that you last pressed it. So in running up to the launch, I was doing test exposures to try to get a better understanding of what the light looked like. And basically, when the launch took off, I was actually taking an exposure. So I saw the launch light up on the horizon. I pressed the shutter button. It ended what I thought was nothing to start the frame, but it was actually ending an exposure. And I watched the whole 8 or 9 minute sequence. It was incredible. And I pressed it again when I thought I was ending that exposure, and it started another one. So
Oh,
so that was a pretty big bummer. And I've had minor gaffes along those lines, knocking focus slightly. Nothing else that comes to mind that's that major, but that was a hard one for sure.
yeah. Well, and what photos are you most proud of, or are your favorites? Because I think my some of my favorites of yours are the Falcon Heavy launch with the focusing on the jet fumes. Oh, I don't know how to describe it. The fire, coming out of the back of the three boosters
Mhm.
from the 27 Merlin engines. So I'm interested in those particular photos because I've been to a launch. I'm lucky enough to have seen one, and I did what most people do, which is film it on an iPhone, and all you get is a kind of fireball, which looks like the sun rising for a few seconds, and then when it lands back on the launch pad, it's
Mhm.
like the sunset. So yeah, so that for example, how do you capture those sorts of photos, and what are your favorites?
Mhm. So I'll tackle the favorites one first, and if I go on too long, remind me of what the latter question was. It's a really fascinating discussion and something I've put a lot more thought into in the last few months about what makes a great spaceflight photo, and I think it's a balance of the photo itself being sort of inherently cool, amazing, novel, beautiful, and then the significance of the launch itself. So you could have a very, very unique photo, for example, rocket going right in front of the moon or the sun, but if it's of what is admittedly a lower key launch, less important, more routine flight, for example, a Starlink mission, the photo's importance is sort of based around the fact that you did something cool with the photo, but
Mm,
the mission does not carry as much weight as if it was a debut launch of Falcon Heavy or the Space Launch System, or in a few months maybe Starship. And when you can combine both of those into the same photo, you get an objectively novel or great photo of a debut launch. Those are the most spectacular to me. But on the other hand, there are times where you get otherwise cool but routine photos of those significant launches. Generic kind of telephoto in-flight shots of a Falcon Heavy or something. Those are cool, but they're not always great photographs. So to give you one example of a recent favorite, and I'm still kind of thinking about where this slates in among my favorite images of all time, but I was able to get the Artemis 1 launch flying in front of the moon. And there are some, I guess, technical deficiencies to that photo that I'm not really fond of. You can't actually see the rocket because the flames and from the engines and the solid boosters were so bright that it really washed out the rocket. So you sort of just see the nozzles, the flame, and then the moon. But to get Artemis 1, our sort of beginning of our return to the moon, flying in front of the moon, that's something that, like, I don't know if it's fate. I don't know what it is. It's probably just happenstance that the launch delayed enough and took off when the moon was not only in the sky but low enough in the sky. The clouds weren't in the way. There wasn't too much moisture. I was able to get access to a spot where that lined up. The launch went off that night. If it went a day or two later, the moon might not have even been up. So it's combining those sort of two factors: the greatness of the photo, but then the historical nature of the mission or the novelty of the mission. Those are the ones that really stand out. And just to rattle off a couple more, there's the Mars 2020 mission that I flew in a plane for. And then let me pull up my portfolio here just to see if there's any that I'm not thinking of. So there's the Artemis, there's the Mars 2020 from the plane. Um, there's Inspiration4 where I got that kind of wild post-sunset nebula photo. And then as I'm looking here, it is some more of those photos that are not necessarily significant missions, but they're novel because I flew in a plane before sunrise, or I lined up something with the moon during a commercial satellite mission. So it's something that I give a lot more thought to in the last maybe year, 6 months, about what can I try during the less significant missions that allows me to be ready to take those risks during the bigger missions. And then as for how I capture those flame shots, that I did remember the question despite rambling on. Um, those are just taken with what we call remote cameras that are stationed near the launch pads, usually a couple 100 feet away. Those are almost always sound activated, so the noise of the rocket lifting off actually activates a small trigger, which I don't have one immediately accessible, but it's a small trigger that plugs into the camera. And as long as the noise is over a sort of arbitrary threshold, which generally lasts for 20 to 30 seconds, the camera will just fire away and take a lot of images. And then the camera settings for those are exposed for like almost the sun. So that Falcon Heavy image from the other night, I think it was at 1/8,000th of a second at f16 and ISO 100. So very, very dark camera settings to expose for that fire.
That's fascinating. I can tell that you think about the creative side of the pictures. It's not just taking a picture of a rocket, which anyone can do with a nice camera. It's capturing the significance and the moment in history, which you do so well. And I'm sure you've been asked this hundreds of times, so I'm not going to ask how you started shooting because I've watched you in other interviews. And you started being a photographer in school. But what I am interested in is how you got selected to cover Inspiration4. So am I right in that you actually applied through the Shift 4 competition, and then you got a call back one day from Scott Petit, Kid, who has been on the podcast as well. Perhaps you could sort of touch on that moment where you got the call back, and
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Yeah,
what was in your mind when you found out?
yeah. I'll real quick touch on the sort of beginning of it all, just in case if anyone who's listening hasn't listened to other appearances or followed me online. Um, so when I was a freshman in high school, I was pretty bored bouncing between hobbies. Wasn't incredibly academically inclined. I just sort of struggled with the motivation to get through the daily monotony of going to school, sitting through a class, and I didn't necessarily think I was like too good for school. I didn't have like for example with Jared, like I didn't have a business idea that I wanted to just leave school and start a tech company. But like him, I did get a little bored of the raising your hand to go to the bathroom. Um, and I quickly was thinking of other things I'd rather be doing, and I just randomly bought a camera. Knew some people that did photography, was vaguely intrigued by it, and I figured I'd buy a camera with some, I guess, Christmas and birthday money. But it wasn't a grand vision. It wasn't, I'm going to start a spaceflight photography career. I wasn't going to start a photography career. I just bought a camera. And there was a rocket launch about a month later. It was a Falcon 9 flight, I think flight 11 or 12. It was the launch of a NASA NOAA mission called Discover. I photographed it from the beach. It was like, okay, cool. When's the next one? I'll do that. And from there, it just snowballed. I quickly became more and more interested in all the different kinds of images you could take. And after about a year, I got accepted under a space news media outlet called America Space, thanks to their editor, Mike Killian. He noticed my work and was willing to sort of take me under his wing and grant me that media access on site at Cape Canaveral, where I began doing all the remote camera stuff. Fast forward to graduation of high school in 2018. I had been doing this a few years now. I really loved it, and I actually missed the deadline to apply for what was the local, like, small state college that I would have pursued a general AA degree in, just to sort of figure out what I wanted to do. And I realized, like, oh crap, I missed the deadline. I guess I'll just do a gap year of photography. I'll see where that puts me in a year, and then if it's maybe profitable, I'll do another gap year. But the goal was at that point to just go back to school after a year because I was so burnt out on that classroom environment. And a few weeks into that summer, I just knew like that was the answer. Like I was going to make it work somehow. And then, a few more years of covering launches and working directly with launch companies, Inspiration4 came around, and I was down in Starbase when they made that announcement um, that there's going to be a civilian mission on SpaceX's Dragon spacecraft, which immediately caught my attention because not only I think it was like 8 months prior, I watched Demo 2 fly with NASA astronauts, and that was the first crewed space flight that I had photographed. I had seen shuttle growing up, but I didn't have that connection to the industry or really rockets, engineering, space, or anything, or photography, the medium through which I now appreciate all of this stuff. I didn't have that watching shuttle. But watching Demo 2 and then Crew 1 and just getting a hint of human space flight, Inspiration4 immediately caught my attention. So I built a small campaign to sell prints and make a video and donate those profits to St. Jude, the charitable um, beneficiary of Inspiration4. Just sort of put my story out there. I don't think I really thought that I had a chance. I think maybe I did underestimate the sort of, up and comer young guy pursuing his passion aspect that people I think are really drawn to with my work because I really feel like I am just a guy that takes photos of a cool subject matter and maybe people related to that in a small way. But fast forward to early March, I started hearing murmurs in the community that some sort of finalist group was selected or they were undergoing additional screening. I don't remember the source of those rumors, but they kind of came from many different angles of the industry, from friends and whatnot. So I figured at that point, having not heard anything, it was a very good chance that I did not win, which I was okay with. I didn't feel entitled to win that seat or anything. It ultimately went to Dr. Cyan Proctor, and I don't think there's a more deserving or fitting human on the planet for what that seat was designed to represent, and what she did with that seat, with her art, her passion for spaceflight, almost being selected as a NASA astronaut. She sort of channeled that seat into the ultimate representation of what I think it meant to be on Inspiration4, and I'm really proud of her for it. But I got a email in early March, about a week after that sort of initial realization that I didn't win, and it was from Scott Kidd Poteet, the mission director of Inspiration4, and it was a very vague email. I think it came on a Sunday afternoon. Did not expect it in any capacity, and he simply alluded to an opportunity with Inspiration4. So of course at that point I'm like, oh my God, maybe there's someone fell out, maybe they need one more finalist just to be judged or something, right? And I responded. I'm like, great, we can hop on a call. And a few hours later, we hopped on a call. Started out, it was pretty awkward. We were kind of just waiting on what, I don't know. We were just sitting there talking, making small talk. And then out of nowhere, he's like, all right, Jared's hopping on now. And I didn't realize it was like that Jared. I kind of was like, no way, like the guy, the Jared. He's like, yep. And then he hopped on, and Jared and I'd say hit it off. We had a pretty organic, natural conversation that was mostly about space before it even was about the potential role that I could serve for Inspiration4. And we got into that, and he asked if I'd be interested in basically being the campaign photographer, which it ended up working out amazing. Got to document that whole campaign in photos and immortalize that experience for, most importantly, the crew and their families, but also the general public and ultimately history, which will hopefully look back on those photos and um, enjoy looking through them and how they capture that historic campaign. But funnily, at some point during my whole um, print sale campaign to fly on the mission, Jared or someone from Shift4, I think it might have been Jared because we'd interacted a bit on Twitter. They they bought some prints from that charity fundraiser and then had them shipped to Shift4. And because I signed and fulfilled all those prints myself, I figured like, hey, if I don't win, I should probably ask if I can take some photos for them. So I put a little handwritten signed note in there with my information. It said like, hey, if I don't win, can I take some photos for the campaign and still serve this mission in some capacity? And it ended up being it wasn't even that note that made Jared or Kid or the campaign think to reach out to take those photos, because he didn't get the note until after our call. It was just happenstance that they had the same idea as me, to grant me the opportunity to work with the campaign. So that's kind of like a cool example of, I guess, fate or something. But yeah, that's the story of how I got in with Inspiration4, and it's been a pretty great almost 2 years now working with that team now into the Polaris program.
That's so cool, man. I had no idea that you. I knew you were. I knew as part of the sort of competition element, you sold pictures, but I didn't realize you actually sent them pictures as well. That's so cool. And I'm lucky enough to have chatted to Jared as well, and everyone I've spoken to do with inspiration, and Haley Arsenault, and you know everyone seems to have such an inspirational story, including yourself, which is amazing. And I've just realised how old you must be if you left high school in 2018, which is even more a testament to how well you've done, man. That is epic. Do you think that was part of the
Thank
rationale
you.
behind the decision to get you involved? Because having young people that can stick with the program, because these, especially Polaris, is going to take probably 10 plus years for the 3 missions, and having a team that can grow with the program. Um, is that the sort of, does it feel like a sort of young team? I mean, Jared himself is quite young. Does it feel sort of different to historically how NASA has been with perhaps a more sort of startup mentality to these missions?
Yeah, yeah, a few things there. So I'll touch on the age for the whole team first. I'd say it's a very wide-ranging age group. We have a lot of experienced former Air Force pilots that are on our team, and they provide just incalculable levels of expertise on our, aircraft operations, and then how that can be applied to spaceflight training. And they help lead the program as a whole. And the Polaris Dawn crew is an incredibly diverse and talented, wide-ranging group of 4 humans that I think together are just, I mean, I can't imagine a better crew for the objectives for that mission. As it relates to my age and how I got involved with Inspiration4, it's hard to say. I don't know if the age was a big factor in why I brought on, but I think Jared saw my passion and drive for a very niche subject matter at a young age, and maybe that was interesting and exciting for him, and maybe that played a part. But on age in general, for myself, I struggle a bit on. I don't promote my age really anymore. When I started, it was definitely something that I admittedly took total advantage of. It was, people were drawn to the fact that a 15, 16, 17-year-old was working in this professional capacity, because my media access at the Cape at that time, and still now, it's not a I was talking to someone about this the other day. It's not like a sort of program for young people. It's not a, I wasn't there under sort of any academic context, or, they didn't announce, hey, we're going to bring out the most driven young spaceflight photographer, apply here. I in high school was working in a real time professional context, and I think that really had me driven to want to pursue this as much as I could, because I was, in one part stuck in the classroom, then leaving school early to go set up cameras next to an orbital rocket launch. Like that was a very unique contrast, and I think I realized, subconsciously or not, like that had me, like I was just really driven and attached to that opportunity. But but on one hand, being young and having that opportunity was definitely something that people were drawn to, and I did not I did not waste the ability to highlight my age when I was younger. I'd say around 18 or so, when I graduated, sort of that adult transition, making it a real full-time career, I sort of phased out making my age a selling point, because I mean I'm 23 now, but if I'm 23, 24 at this point, I don't think it's hugely relevant to the actual work I'm doing and what I put out. But yeah, I'll totally admit, early on it was a something I highlighted. But I mean, I may get good photos now sometimes at 23. I'm sure in 2, 3, 4 years I'll get great photos then. It's not something I'm hugely focused on now.
Oh, mate, you're incredible. And I was trying to do some research as to who was the sort of NASA photographer during the Apollo era. And I don't know. There was a few names like Ralph Morse was pretty prolific. He was with NASA for 30 years. Um, so much so that John Glenn dubbed him as the eighth astronaut. And it's sort of similar to how you were sort of connected so much to the Polaris team because a key part is photographing their training. So you actually get to go and experience, be that zero G experiences or fighter jet training or mountaineering. Um, what's the what's the toughest part about that? Is it the technical side of trying to take the photos in these extreme environments, or is it the physical side as well? Because it's quite taxing for anyone. So yeah, what's your thoughts around being the kind of extra astronaut in the room?
Yeah, definitely not an astronaut, nor can I, even pretend to be close. But I do find myself in some of those environments. But what's great is everyone on the team, and especially Jared, which ultimately, um, his trust and understanding, as well as the whole crew. That's really important for me to be able to do the job because I need to be there. I need to have the trust that there may be extreme moments where they're focused on training, and I may get a little close with the camera while still respecting that they're training. But just me being able to be there and everyone being comfortable with it, that is my first and foremost personal responsibility, is making sure that people are okay with me being where I need to be to document this stuff. As it relates to the actual training, I wouldn't say in any capacity. I'd say 99% of the time I'm not actually doing the training. There are some times where I might step in to hold something, help, grab a coffee, um, assist in some way that you could maybe argue is giving me that experience, but I'm not actually going through the centrifuge spins, or I mean, there's not a spacesuit with my name on it, nor will there be maybe ever. We'll see. That's way down the line, maybe. Um, but the focus is I'm capturing these moments for the crew, and I need to be there. Um, but I get a taste of it. Um, I've done a little bit of the mountaineering. I've done some zero G flights, and I do fly in the jets. But again, as I've said, it's always sort of that adjacent but present role of how can I do this while making sure that the focus is on the crew and their training, and not trying to actually experience the training myself. And what's great is the team knows that I'm primarily there to take the photos, not to experience the things or do the training. Yet at the same time, they are so willing to let me be involved on things that I didn't really expect going in. Ahead of Inspiration4, I thought it would be a very kind of hands off, all right, come on out, take some photos, great. We'll see you in a month or two. Glad you could stop in for half an hour kind of thing. But very quickly, I became a total member of the team. And
Yeah.
working with the team was something that I had not really done in my career thus far until Inspiration4 and now Polaris. So being a part of something that's greater than myself and my own work covering launches, that's really what I've come to appreciate in the last few years doing this. It's just cool to take photos, and they are for something greater than sort of being thrown onto social media. And maybe there's some trolls, maybe they don't get a lot of attention, but documenting these experiences for the crew and their family, and sure, I get a little taste of what it's like to fly in zero G in a jet or stuff like that. That's fun, but it really ultimately is about doing the role I'm in, and that's taking photos of these crews.
No, I get the distinction, and you're capturing history, which is such a significant role for you. Do you train any of the or did you train any of the Inspiration4 astronauts, and are you training any of the Polaris astronauts on how to take decent pictures? Because one assumes, they will want to take pictures, especially for Polaris. Um, is there any sort of basic training that you give them, or do they sort of know their way around a camera already?
Inspiration4, it was rather basic training because of the timeline we were on. By the time we realized in the campaign that photography was something the crew did want to focus on, we were pretty much approaching the launch date rather quickly. They flew with a Nikon Z7 II, a couple lenses, and their own personal iPhones. And they ultimately gravitated toward the iPhones for a lot of their photos, which I think is kind of fitting, for more or less everyday people flying to space, and they got amazing photography on their iPhones, and they dabbled a bit in using the professional Nikon. I think that's pretty cool. For Polaris Dawn, I am training a few of the crew members more specifically on operating the Nikon, diving very deep, very quickly into photography fundamentals, as well as just very hyper specific stuff on exposure, composition that is trying to go beyond the most fundamental, basic levels of, what's a good exposure, what is the rule of thirds, that kind of stuff. And they're making great progress, and we have a few months before they launch. So as much data as we can and put into their heads about taking good photos, I'm going to take advantage of that time.
Yeah, 100%. And I guess I'm sure you don't really think about this, but hypothetically, you could, if one of the Polaris missions does go to the moon, you could be that impact of you helping them to take pictures could affect the next iconic pictures we get from the moon, which is pretty cool. Well, you sort of said, it's not on the cards yet, but say in a few years' time there was a kind of opportunity to go to space for you. There's things like Dear Moon and which uh, Tim, Everyday Astronaut, is going on, which is amazing. He's another guy I'd love to chat to on the podcast some point. But would you go? And would you, would do you think your path to space is going to be photography? Is that where is that your path if you want to go?
Yeah, it's something that I try not to think about too much. Lately, I've really tried to focus on the present and what is the sort of near rocks item. I don't think that's a super widely used phrase, but the team here uses it in the aviation context of like, you got to focus on what's right in front of the jet, and if you're flying through a canyon, it's those close rocks that you have to worry about, and still keep an eye out on what could come. But like right now, my focus is on a few things. It's covering rocket launches here at the Cape and wherever else I can get to. It's covering Polaris and human spaceflight, and then it's trying to grow in my personal life, be a better person, try to get a little bit better shape this year, maybe walk a little more, drink a lot more water, that kind of stuff. But I mean, yeah, I think about what it might be like to go to space one day. I think what's really exciting is missions like Inspiration4 and the Polaris program. Their fundamental goal is to expand access to space for more and more people. And ultimately, with the third flight of Polaris being the first human flight of Starship, which is a goal we announced when we announced this program about a year ago. I think if Starship works, and Jared says this a lot, if Starship works, it will open up space in a way that right now we can't even imagine. And the analogy I like to use, I actually can't remember if I read this or if I just kind of said it once and it stuck in my own head, but we couldn't imagine when the iPhone came out what the App Store would allow people to build and create. In fact, when the iPhone came out, I think the App Store was still a year or so behind because they didn't initially want third-party apps on the App Store. And I think that sort of applies to the entire spaceflight industry. What companies that may not exist yet are going to build the platforms and the applications that are going to change the way we operate both on Earth and in space. And with that, I think human access to space is going to democratize in a way that right now we can't imagine. And if that's in 5 years, 10 years, 25 years, I'd love to be a small part of that. I think if I were to take the risk of going to space, I think for that risk to be worthwhile to me, it would probably have to be on an orbital flight. I think the suborbital flights on, for example, Blue Origin and Virgin Galactic, I think those are great experiences. I don't really want to get into the debate on whether or not those people are astronauts. I think they take a significant personal risk in basically strapping themselves to a bomb to go really high and really fast. I think that's really incredible. But for me to take that risk, I think a large part of it would be to take photos in space for a prolonged time. And if I'm going to do that, I think almost selfishly, I guess, in a sense, I would prefer to go to orbit. But that's not to say that a suborbital or orbital space flight is something that is near term for me. It's not something that I'm focused on or has even been offered. So long-winded way of saying, like, yeah, I would love to go to space one day, and I think the industry is on a really promising path to where you could justify a seat going to someone whose primary focus is capturing a mission. But who knows? That's kind of
That's
an exciting unknown, and yeah.
Yeah, it's an amazing answer, man. It's really inspirational to chat to you. Just before you go, I'd like to. You may not even know this yet, but with Polaris Dawn coming up, have you thought about how you're going to photograph that? I don't know what your planning and creative process is. So if you have no idea, don't worry. But I was just intrigued, kind of. It is a significant start of a new program with big aspirations. Do you know how you're going to capture that moment?
I don't know yet. It's something that I think about often, and this is all publicly known, but the launch has shifted a little bit. When we announced the program about a year ago, I think it was going to be toward the end of 22. Now it's looking like the first quarter-ish of 23, and that's all stuff we've said publicly. But that little bit of shift has given me some more time to think about what kind of impacts I could make with the launch photography of Polaris Dawn. And there's a few ideas, and right now they're just ideas in my head, and I've discussed it a little bit with our team. But for context, I photographed Inspiration4 from the roof of the vehicle assembly building, as well as having remote cameras at and around the launch pad. And I think that was great. I think I got some really unique stuff, and I was lucky that um, the team trusted me to have that access. SpaceX enabled that access for me. But I think I want to push the boundaries with Polaris Dawn. Um, so that's all I'll share for now. I definitely do want to do something that is, as I keep saying, novel and exciting, for what will hopefully be an incredible human spaceflight mission, for what I know will be a great mission.
Well, look, it is inspirational to chat to you, and thank you for what you do for the industry. I know there's a lot of people that value your work and the way you capture these historic moments. So thank you so much. And perhaps we'll get you back on the podcast in a year or so, and we can evaluate those pictures. Thank you so much.
Totally. Yeah, thanks for having me, man. I appreciate it.